Contemporary relevance of normative political theory. Normative political theory, long associated with classical questions about justice, liberty, and the role of the state, remains indispensable in analyzing the moral foundations of modern political life. As societies confront unprecedented global challenges from climate change and digital surveillance to rising inequality and post-colonial trauma, normative theory provides a critical ethical framework for evaluating existing institutions and envisioning alternatives grounded in justice and human dignity. In what follows, we examine 5 areas where normative political theory plays a vital role in shaping contemporary discourse and practice: climate justice, global inequality, digital rights and privacy, migration and border ethics, and post-colonial reparations. 1. Climate justice. Climate change is not merely a scientific or technical problem. It is also a profoundly moral and political issue. Normative political theory is essential to framing the ethical dimensions of environmental degradation and guiding responses that are just, inclusive, and future-oriented. Intergenerational justice. One of the most urgent questions in climate ethics is, what do we owe to future generations? Philosophers like Brian Barry and Derek Parfit argue that current generations have a duty not to impose harm on those who come after them. Rawlsian theories of justice, adapted to environmental contexts, suggest that intergenerational equity must be a basic principle of policy design. B. Distributive and procedural justice. Normative theory helps distinguish between distributive justice, how the burdens and benefits of climate action are shared, and procedural justice, who participates in decision-making processes. The disproportionate impact of climate change on the global south, indigenous communities, and marginalized populations raises questions of fairness, colonial legacies, and representation in international forums. C. Climate reparations. There is growing normative debate about whether wealthy nations owe climate reparations for their historical emissions. Normative theorists such as Henry Shue and Simon Caney argue that those most responsible for climate harm have a moral duty to compensate and assist those most affected. This shifts the conversation from charity to justice. 2. Global inequality. In an age of globalization, massive disparities in wealth, health, and opportunity have become morally and politically indefensible. Normative political theory provides tools for analyzing global injustice and articulating the responsibilities of states, corporations, and individuals. Cosmopolitanism versus statism. A central normative debate is between cosmopolitan theorists who argue that justice applies globally and statists who claim that justice is confined within state borders. Thinkers like Thomas Pogge and Charles Bates argue that global institutions perpetuate structural injustice and that affluent nations have duties beyond their borders. B. The capability approach. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's capability approach reorients justice away from economic metrics and toward the real freedoms people have to lead lives they value. This has profound implications for how development is measured and pursued, emphasizing education, health, and agency over GDP growth. C. The ethics of trade, debt, and tax. Normative theory critically examines global economic institutions, such as the World Bank, IMF, and WTO. Questions include, are global trade agreements fair? Should illegitimate debt be forgiven? Is tax avoidance by multinational corporations morally acceptable? These issues require ethical scrutiny of structural power and accountability that normative theory can uniquely provide. 3. Digital rights and privacy. The digital age has transformed the political landscape, raising novel ethical challenges about data, surveillance, artificial intelligence, and human autonomy. Normative political theory is essential in articulating rights and responsibilities in this rapidly evolving domain. The right to privacy. What is the moral basis for the right to privacy in an era of surveillance, capitalism, and biometric tracking? Thinkers draw on Kantian notions of dignity and autonomy to argue that invasion of privacy violates the moral agency of individuals. Normative theorists ask what limits should be placed on governments and corporations in collecting personal data. B. Algorithmic bias and fairness. Normative theory engages with algorithmic justice by asking whether AI systems reflect and reinforce social biases. Scholars like Virginia Eubanks and Cathy O'Neil highlight how data systems can entrench inequality. Ethical frameworks such as distributive justice, non-discrimination, and procedural transparency are vital to guiding digital governance. C. Digital democracy and free speech. How can digital platforms ensure free expression while preventing harm, misinformation, and hate speech? Normative theory explores the balance between liberty and harm, echoing Mill's harm principle in contemporary contexts. Deliberative Democrats, like Habermas, raise concerns about rational discourse in fragmented digital publics. 4. Migration and border ethics. The movement of people across borders, whether for economic opportunity, family reunification, or escaping violence, poses deep ethical questions about sovereignty, community, and human rights. Normative political theory provides principled responses to increasingly polarized migration debates. Open borders versus closed communities. A key normative question is, do states have a moral right to restrict immigration? Some theorists, e.g. Joseph Cairns, argue for open borders, emphasizing equal moral worth and the arbitrariness of birthright citizenship. Others argue for the moral value of political community, raising questions about democratic self-determination and cultural identity. B. Refugee protection and responsibility sharing. The 1951 Refugee Convention enshrines obligations to protect those fleeing persecution. Normative theory demands that these obligations be interpreted generously and globally. Thinkers like David Miller explore how burdens should be fairly distributed among states, while human rights theorists emphasize the inviolable dignity of asylum seekers. C. Climate-induced displacement. Normative theory is essential in developing new legal and ethical frameworks for climate migrants who fall outside current refugee law. Scholars argue for expanding definitions of forced displacement, creating climate visas, or establishing regional protection agreements, grounded in justice and solidarity. 5. Post-colonial reparations. The legacies of colonialism, economic underdevelopment, racial hierarchies, cultural erasure continue to structure global power dynamics. Normative political theory has taken on the task of evaluating calls for historical redress, apology, and reparations in light of justice and accountability. Moral responsibility for historical injustice. How do we assign moral responsibility for actions committed by past generations? Theories of collective responsibility and transgenerational justice argue that states and institutions can bear ongoing duties to acknowledge and remedy the harms of colonialism, slavery, and genocide. B. Material and symbolic reparations. Reparations debates involve both material compensation, e.g., land returns, economic transfers, and symbolic gestures, g. official apologies, memorialization. Normative theorists weigh the value of restorative versus retributive justice, exploring how to heal historical trauma while promoting reconciliation and systemic reform. C. Decolonizing normative theory itself. Post-colonial scholars challenge normative theory to examine its own Eurocentric assumptions, arguing for epistemic justice, recognizing indigenous, African, Asian, and non-Western traditions of political thought. This decolonization of normative theory enhances its ability to speak to plural global realities. Conclusion. toward a justice-oriented political future. As the world becomes more interconnected and volatile, normative political theory is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It compels us to confront foundational ethical questions that empirical research alone cannot answer. What is a just climate policy? How should we respond to growing inequality between and within nations? What rights must individuals retain in the digital realm? Who belongs in a political community, and on what terms? How do we repair historical wrongs while building just futures? In these areas, normative political theory offers moral clarity, critical insight, and visionary imagination. It enables scholars, policymakers, and citizens to move beyond technocratic solutions and confront the values and principles that shape political life. By engaging with real-world challenges, climate catastrophe, digital authoritarianism, forced migration, systemic racism, normative theory reaffirms its contemporary relevance. It becomes not only a field of academic inquiry, but a source of moral leadership and public purpose in the 21st century.